Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation of IDIS 300 Life After COVID. I'm Betsy Lewis. I'm the Assistant Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm also a professor of Spanish. So I get the special pleasure today to introduce to you two of my colleagues in Spanish in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures. We have with us today Dr. Marisa Martinez Mira and Dr. Gonzalo Campos Dintrans, my two colleagues in Spanish who are also specialists in linguistics, and they're going to talk to us today about language rights in the wake of COVID-19. But before I turn it over to them, I wanted to remind you about a few kind of housekeeping things. On the webinar, Zoom webinar, you can do the chat would only send messages to the panelists. So if you're having some technical problems that you need to alert us about, you can send us a message that way. But the Q&A function is really where you should interact. You can, as you're listening to the presentations, you can pose questions for the Q&A session after the presentation. And you can also read what your fellow viewers are asking, and you can vote for the questions that you are most interested in being posed. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Martinez Mira.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. Thank you for this lovely introduction. Let me just, first of all, hope that everybody can see the PowerPoint that I'm going to be using. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here today. I'm Professor Marisa Martinez Mira, teacher Spanish here in Mary, Washington. And today, together with my colleague Gonzalo Campos Dintrans, we're going to be talking about language rights in the wake of COVID-19. Specifically, we're going to be discussing Michael Kelly's article, Languages and the Coronavirus Crisis. We selected that article because we thought it was a good summary of linguistic issues related to COVID-19, and although the article doesn't extensively discuss these issues, we thought it was a good starting point to learn about them in later trigger discussions. So I'm going to be discussing the first three sections of that article, specifically the importance of multilingual communication, the role of translation and interpreting, and the creativity of languages and responding to the crisis. And Dr. Campos will be talking about online communication, language learning, and language representation. And after that, we'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Okay, so the first section of that article deals with multilingual communication, and I thought the best way to start talking about this was using this quote from the actual article. The emphasis in mine is not in the original article that reads, communication in many languages has become a key issue in many aspects of the crisis. At the most urgent level, it is important to make useful information available to entire populations, regardless of the languages they use, so that people can deal with the issues it raises for everyday life and can modify their behavior. Okay, so for a second, before I continue, think about ourselves like a year and a half ago. We were having normal lives, and one day, all of a sudden, we wake up, everything shuts down. Apparently, there is something in the air, and it's not love, and we don't know what to do about it. It's a new virus that's spreading everywhere. It seems to be deadly. So most of us probably, because we were concerned and scared, went to Google and tried to find as much information as possible about this new virus. Something that seems so easy and so natural, so normal to some of us might not be the case for other communities, okay? So for example, if my computer allows me to move to the next slide, let's think how this applies to, for example, minority communities. And by that, I mean both local, for example, think about Native Americans here in the United States, or speakers of indigenous languages in South American countries, or like the article mentions, speakers of Welsh in the United Kingdom, or foreign-based, like people coming from other countries who might have different degrees of proficiency in the national or official language of the country. Because of that, access to that crucial information might be quite difficult, and this is a time in which knowing about the virus, knowing and understanding about the virus can become an issue of life or death, which takes me to, or lead me to the next issue I wanted to discuss. How is this crucial health-related information disseminated, especially for those speakers of minority languages, being local or foreign-based, okay? Is this information available in more than one language, in one of those minority languages? In which format is that information available? I mentioned before using Google, but is that information in minority languages also available in posters or brochures? Do these minority members of the community members have access to those linguistic resources in a language other than the state language? Let's say if they go to physical spaces like hospitals, schools, are they able to find information in minority language, or is it made available only online? So as the article points out, the big question here is there significant information shared through other languages? Okay, and maybe I understand, and we all understand that having all this information in every single language that is spoken in the world might be challenging or a daunting task, but think about those countries in which there are large populations with their own language, like those national minorities. What kind of access do they have to that information in their own language? Are the linguistic needs of these populations being taken into account? Or as I mentioned here, what if these community members aren't tech savvy and can just go to Google because they don't have a good computer or a good Wi-Fi connection, okay? So let me just show you, if I can find my computer, my screen here. I would like to share with you, this is the main page of the FDA, in which you see you have access to multilingual COVID-19 related resources. You can see it's written, the infographic here, it's written in Chinese. If you see several languages here other than English, for example, Portuguese, Vietnamese, Korean. And if I want to find information, let's say about the Pfizer vaccine, I find a significant amount of information about the vaccine in languages other than English, okay? So this is an excellent resource to find out very crucial health-related information. But like I said, is it available only online? Is there any way members of these communities might be able to access this information? And it means that it's not a computer or a website. That's something that we really need to think about. Here you have the links for that page in case you're interested. I want to see what resources are available. And having that information available in several minority languages does have a very good, very noticeable impact in the morale and in the way those communities deal with this issue. Here you have an example. This is a link mentioned in Kelly's article, and focuses on the experience of two scholars from Mexico who realized that Nahuatl speakers didn't have access to information in Nahuatl, okay? Because the local health authorities were not paying much attention to that. So they started to create those materials in Nahuatl. They created posters, distributed it throughout the community, and as you can see there in the links that are on the sentences that are highlighted in red, it made a difference. Having able to access that information in their own minority languages made a huge difference and had a great impact, which leads us to the conclusion that, as you can see in the second line highlighted in red, language-centered approach to health is crucial, and everybody is entitled and has the right to it. That is a perfect, actually, transition to the next section of the presentation, which is the role of translation and interpreting. Okay, so yeah, hold on a second. I don't know why it's not, my computer is not cooperating here. Okay, so we're talking about multilingual communication, and I think we can say that English has been the lingua franca of used to disseminate this information. So translating and interpreting has been crucial dealing with this pandemic. Okay? Now, how it's been translated, how it's been interpreted, which languages have benefited from this. We have different degrees of success. And when it comes to indigenous of minority languages, for a second, I would like to focus my attention on the issue of interpreting. Think about hospitals that all of a sudden start getting people sick with COVID or with COVID symptoms, and they are not fluent in English, and they need an interpreter. Okay, do those hospitals have enough resources to hire certified interpreters in other languages that are needed? We're providing these hospitals with enough resources to support these interpreters, okay? And because of the COVID related protocols, interpreting in particular has been complicated because of, like there's been issues with in-person interpreting because of social distancing issues, also with computer mediated interpretation, things like if you have to interpret what somebody who is sick has to say, talking through a mask might be difficult to understand and interpret that sentence right on the spot. So there's been, because of lack of time, I actually don't have time to show you these two videos. Are very short, they're like 3 or 4 minutes each, okay? In which I think they are a really good example of what the situation for these interpreters dealing with these challenges created with the need to interpret for minority languages looks like. So I encourage everybody who take a look at this, how this actually takes place in real life. Okay, so because of this, there's been more reliance on computer mediated interpretation or computer mediated translation using translation apps. Welcome to Google Translate, which has been the most used one. Okay, in most cases, the translation, and I'm focusing a little bit on translation. The translation provided by those software programs has been questionable, like low quality translation, which, as you can see here, sometimes it has done more harm than good. Okay, like for example, things with pragmatic inconsistencies. Okay, Spanish has two ways of translating the pronoun you. One is formal context, and another one is colloquial context. When you enter a text in Google Translate, it doesn't make any difference whether if it's colloquial or formal. So the final result might be a little bit confusing mixing those two registers, okay? Depending on the skill or how updated the translation software is, they might be able to translate every single word, or maybe they don't know how to translate words that are really, really new and are related to the COVID crisis. So if they don't translate it into minority languages, it doesn't do any service, right? And those are little things that when put together, it's just contributing to issues with multilingual communication, and it might reinforce linguistic inequalities, especially when we talk about the issue with speakers of minority languages. Okay? Here I also provided a link to, so that you can see the actual result of this linguistic inequalities. Truth to be told, this is an article from 2019, so this is before the pandemic began, but I thought it was still relevant because basically was this article is saying is that the former the Trump administration was trying to limit the access to interpreters in hospitals because according to some health insurers, and you have it here highlighted, providing too many interpreters was excessively burdensome and while adding little value for consumers. So as you can imagine, doctors and nurses highly opposed this. And this is federal law, okay? They cannot get rid of interpreters. They cannot do that. What the insurance companies were trying to do is to obscure this a little bit, okay? Now you go to a hospital and you see posters, flyers saying you have the right to interpreter. If you need one, please call this number. So that's what they were trying to obscure, like getting rid of those posters. So if you go to a hospital, you will know that you can have an interpreter or which number to call. So imagine for a second that they had implemented this, they had put this into place, and then the pandemic hits. If they thought nobody will know about this and therefore they didn't have to hire enough interpreters, all of a sudden you have hundreds of people who need one. That will be quite catastrophic, I think. So bottom line, since we're talking about language rights, another opportunity to say that equal access to information is a right, regardless of which language this information is communicated. Okay. The last section of the article that I'm going to discuss has to do with creativity of languages and responding to the crisis. So obviously it's a new virus, it's a novel virus. We need to talk about it. And most of the times we didn't have the words. Of course, new words and terms are created. Not only created, we have some terms that are going to be used in a different context or with a different meaning. So from a linguistic point of view, or I as a linguist, find really interesting to find new terms like social distancing, to bubble, COVID, Zooming, quarantine, which as I found out about recently, and I thought I should have tried that. But anyway, so as a linguist, I have to ask myself, or we as linguists, we have to ask ourselves, which terms will remain in our daily vocabulary, in which context? Formal, sarcastic, ironic, which terms will be forgotten, which terms will be obsolete, okay? And I also, especially related to the issue of translation and interpretation, I wanted to point out issues with this creation of new words and its relation to the textual variation and how it tempers to translation and interpretation, okay? So new terms, do we loan the words from one language to another? Do we adapt those terms to specific languages? I'm showing you here an example with COVID. Spanish makes a difference between grammatical gender, masculine and feminine. I've seen it in the media as la COVID feminine or el COVID, okay? And what if I translate it into a variety or interpret the term when I'm doing interpretation with a word that the person is not very familiar with? And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because I actually experienced this last January. I was teaching a class on Spanish for medical purposes. And of course, we did a module on COVID. So there I am like, okay, I can do this. I can certainly do this. And I write in my list of words that we use in Spanish, only to realize, and it hit me at that moment, that I'm a native speaker of Spanish from Spain. So all the words that I know that are related to COVID in Spanish are particular to my variety of Spanish from Spain. And then I thought, Should I be teaching those words to the students who might have a very limited contact with people from Spain? Should I be teaching them these words according to, for example, Mexican Spanish? And for example, I'm not showing you this slide because I think that everybody knows Spanish, but as you notice, I highlighted two main terms. The first one is for mask, and the second one is for intensive care unit. For mask, I found a myriad of words that I was completely unaware of. The one I will use in my variety of Spanish will be the first one. The third one you have there, barbijo, I didn't even know it existed. Yeah, I just found out about all these terms for intensive care unit that I was unaware of, and yet it makes sense. It's not that I completely I cannot understand what it says, but let me tell you this: I don't want to find out about this the day I go to the hospital because I cannot breathe and then having communication issues. So I thought it was my responsibility to find the right variety to teach, or the right terms to teach when I was teaching that class, because it all contributes to this, to avoid, preventing linguistic inequalities, as I have mentioned before. So I would like to conclude my discussion of these first three sections of the article. Again, reading a direct quotation from a link provided in the Kelly's article. As you can see here, the actual name of the article is COVID-19 Forces Us to Take Linguistic Diversity Seriously. And it reads, in the past, the linguistic disadvantage of minority speakers could be ignored by the mainstream. The COVID-19 crisis has changed that. In a situation where the well-being of everyone depends on that of everyone else, and that relates to our idea of linguistic rights. Ensuring equitable access to information, irrespective of whether someone speaks the state language or not, is in everyone's best interest. So that's what I would like you to remember from this brief talk that I've had before. And I hope that can trigger some good discussion questions, okay? And now I'm just gonna stop sharing. I'll let my colleague continue with our presentation today, okay?
Okay, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for the audience for being here today, and also thank you for the organizers. I will do the following three parts, and the first one has to do with online communication. So before the pandemic, we already had some technology to communicate online. We had streaming, Skype, Zoom, Google Meet, and other applications, of course. I'm sorry. And it was also a very common experience for people who live far away from friends and close relatives. And also at work, teleconferences was a possibility in some cases. However, during the pandemic, and then we can speculate what's going to happen afterwards, online communication became pretty much the norm. That's simply how we socialized and how we worked. Almost everyone in that sense was far away, so we all lived remote somehow. And of course, we have a normalization of this type of situations. I don't know if you remember, but a few years ago, this went viral, and I don't think it would be as surprising today as it was a few years ago. Now, how is online communication different from face-to-face communication? And you can see I posted two pictures there, someone walking in the park and then a treadmill. And the main difference is that online communication is mediated through technology. It's not just a simulation, and it has different limitations, but it also affords different possibilities. If you run on a treadmill and you run outside, you know that you probably prefer outside, but there's certain things you can do on the treadmill that are harder to do outside. So what are some of those limitations? First of all, we are limited by the connection quality, the familiarity with the technology, and the device itself. All of those influence the flow of communication. You probably, as I have, spent a few seconds of any conversation with just checking if we can hear each other, which doesn't normally happen in face-to-face communication. Also, body language is limited. We still have some body language, but it's very limited. And eye contact is not possible, at least with today's technology. In best case scenario, just looking at the camera, right? But not exactly at the person's eyes. So, and that impacts turn taking, which is especially difficult in larger groups. So if you are in a meeting with, let's say, 10 people, trying to decide who's going to speak becomes very hard. And in smaller groups, 3 or 4 people, that's easier. And it's also very hard to interpret certain online behaviors. These are things that do not happen in face-to-face communication, like this one, for example. When you see this instead of a person, you have no idea if they are still there or not. And that, of course, that's something that can only happen in online communication. At the same time, there are also new possibilities that are provided by online communication. First of all, it's easier to have large audiences like we're having today, of course. It's easier to record a meeting because we all have a camera like today. And of course, we all save time in commuting. It also affords new ways to communicate which are not possible or appropriate in face-to-face communication. For example, if you're familiar with any of these emojis, this is definitely things we can do in face-to-face communication, but it just feels a little bit disruptive if we all clap, for example. Instead, you can just insert a little icon. Now, what's going to happen after COVID-19? Of course, we are just speculating, but definitely the technology for online communication will keep improving, probably accelerated by the demands that we have today. Also, users, all of us, have gotten more used to it, and in that sense, we have developed, we are more literate. We have improved our online literacy. And that means that our online communication has improved as well, and it will probably, we will probably still be very proficient in it. Now, the 5th topic, is language learning, and this is very close to us because both Marisa and I teach Spanish, of course, and we have experienced this in real life. So, of course, the change to remote learning was a very disruptive situation. It was also forced. We all just had to do it. And we were all faced with this forced experiment. However, distant learning had already been happening. This was not something completely new. Much technology was already in place, but it was mostly designed to complement face-to-face teaching. And probably the most common online activities were voice recording and peer video conferencing. The other thing we can mention is that during this year of distant teaching, the delivery of contents, the teaching methodologies, and assessment were adapted. In other words, everything had to be different. We had to adapt pretty much everything we did. But at the same time, the use of online technology allowed exploring more resources. So for example, here I chatted with myself today just to give you an idea of what can happen in classes. And I'm gonna read it to you. This is a nice feature of online classes. When we switched to remote in spring 2021, some students who were quiet in class, in main face-to-face class, participated a lot more in the chat room. So, and also the chat room allowed me to see many short writing samples. So in a way, simulating the experience of students writing on the board, but only much better. And this is a very nice feature of chat in Zoom, because students can chat with everybody or just to me. So this is not, the way I did this in face-to-face classes was I had to physically go to a student, see their notebook, and trying to position myself in the classroom and see what they wrote. Now that's a lot easier with in Zoom. So what's going to happen with language learning after COVID-19? Again, this is what we think. First of all, we have a clearer idea of online behavior and a more established virtual classroom etiquette. And this took us a while to figure out what was appropriate, what was not, and what we could do. We also have a better idea of how to take advantage of these online resources. And maybe more of us will be willing to teach or take a second language online. And I would like to think that we have also gained an appreciation of face-to-face teaching. I haven't, all of my friends who are also teachers or professors, we all miss the actual classroom. And so I think the takeaway at this point is that teaching a language online is a good way to learn to use the language online. And that is a goal by itself. let me put it this way. It's really not the same, but it also has a value. Online communication is a thing now. It has been accelerated by COVID-19, and we can definitely get better at it. And this is something that we can keep working on. And the last point is language representation. The main idea here is that, and this is not something new, but COVID has made it very evident, is that the words we use matter for public health, not just for public health, but it's easier to see with public health. So the language used to describe COVID-19 shapes people's attitudes, and attitudes, of course, shape behavior. And with dealing with a pandemic, it's pretty much all about behavior. The media and all of us, through social media, for example, have a responsibility to be mindful of the language we use. The words we use to refer to the virus matter because each one evokes its own set of related concepts, emotions, attitudes, etc. So let me give you some examples that I'm pretty sure you've seen or heard in the previous months. Pandemic and plague. Probably, and I'm not trying to guess what they evoke for you, but to me, plague sounds a little bit more horrifying than pandemic. And even though they are close in meaning, right? Then we have the whole war metaphor. We've been hearing about the war against COVID-19. And when we're talking about war, well, the immediate association I would say is that we have victims, heroes, but we also have a very strong sense of urgency. And also, just think about this: if we are at war, any extreme measures become much easier to justify. But we have also had like flu-like. COVID-19 has been described as a flu-like type of disease, and also the idea that it was airborne. At least for me, when I hear flu-like, it doesn't sound like a big deal. It's basically just a flu. We've been dealing with a flu. And so notice how each of these words are evoking different previous knowledge that we have and previous ideas that we have about other things we've been experienced. Of course, we also have human-made and man-made. These terms have been floating around, which immediately makes us think of a group of people trying to hurt us. And that also puts us in a different position. And of course, we have the infamous Wuhan virus, or even the Asian virus. And I actually saw a bumper sticker here in Fredericksburg, which of course are incredibly xenophobic, and they really don't help us to fight the disease. It only exacerbates any feelings of xenophobia that people may have. And actually, the Yale School of Medicine has offered guidelines for talking about the virus. So this is a screenshot from their website. And this is just one short selection. So they say, for example, do talk about people acquiring or contracted COVID-19, but do not talk about people transmitting COVID-19, infecting others, or spreading the virus, because it implies intentional transmission and assigns blame. Criminalizing or dehumanizing terminology creates impression that those with the disease have somehow done something wrong or are less human than the rest of us, feeding stigma, undermining empathy, and potentially fueling wider reluctance to seek treatment or attend screening, testing, and quarantine. So the main message here is that stigmatization, and this is not the first time that it happens, that a disease is stigmatized, leads to misinformation and just an ineffective control of the disease, because less people are willing to get tested or inform others that they tested positive, for example. There are less people seeking help, and generally speaking, we just have more people isolated and less trust. And that's definitely something we want to avoid when we are fighting, when we, notice how I use the metaphor, when we are dealing with a crisis like this. Now, I would like to give you an example of how headlines, and I'm talking about the media generally, but just think of any type word you find, of any type of headline that you might find, how headlines can influence what we think of a group of people. So I'm going to give you an example. Let's say I rescue a cat from a tree, which is a good deed, right? I think most everybody would agree it's a good thing to do. So the headline that will appear in the future could highlight different attributes to make the reader associate this good deed with a different group of people and still be accurate and true. So we're not talking about fake news, we're talking about accurate information. So I just made up 5 different headlines, and they all start with cat rescued by. All of them are accurate, but hopefully you will see that all of them are gonna make you associate this event with a different group of people. So here's the first one. Cat rescued by UMW professor. Cat rescued by middle-aged man, also true. Cat rescued by Latino male, also true. Cat rescued by Chilean immigrant, also true. And finally, cat rescued by father of 2. So here's what we need to keep in mind. Any of these made up headlines is accurate, but all of them are making you think of a specific group, using it to a specific group linked to this event. And you can, of course, you can also do the same with negative events. I try to keep it positive here, but that's how easy it is to manipulate us into associating certain events with certain groups of people. So in summary, I'm gonna let Marisa now read the summary of her own section, and then I will do mine. Marisa.
Thank you very much. So related to the sections I discussed, for the first one, the main conclusion is that multilingual communication benefits everyone, absolutely everyone, and can help us prepare for future health crisis scenarios, be more prepared and with more resources. We should strive to provide quality translation and interpretation resources to help all communities, because it can be a matter of life or death, and everybody has the right to access translators and interpreters. And linguistic creativity has helped us navigate the COVID-19 health crisis and has a role in multilingual communication. And for us linguists, it's a wonderful field for future research and share our knowledge with our colleagues. Gonzalo?
Thank you. So online communication needs to be better understood, since this is a different medium. And of course, we need more research. And research is already accelerating now because we have so much data today. Mm-hmm. Distance learning has become more common, which opens up a lot of possibilities for the future. And finally, if anything, this crisis has reminded us that the language we use to describe public health has direct implications on public health itself. And with that, we'll thank the audience and the organizers again, and we'll be happy to take any questions and comments. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you to both presenters. Really an excellent, thought-provoking presentation. We really appreciate it. Everybody, my name is Anand Rao. I'm a professor of communication, chair of the Department of Communication and Digital Studies. So there's just so much here that I would like to ask about, and we have a lot of really great questions. I get to start the Q&A, and there's one that has been at the top of the list that I think many of us are really wondering about, and it speaks to this overlap and some really common ground between language and culture. And so I want to start this with Dr. Martinez Mira, and then also ask Dr. Campos if you'd like to comment on this. But the question is, if a group has the same language, but a different culture, could that be an impediment to how the message comes across as well? And so certainly thinking about this in terms of public health, will the difference in culture have an impact the way that language difference might?
Well, thank you for the question. It's really a very good question. My first answer would be to say yes, but it's not so black and white. There are a lot of issues to consider. Different minorities, different cultures obviously have an impact. I can think that, for example, in my own country, if we think, for example, about the Gypsy community with their own culture, they all might speak Spanish, but in terms of access to health resources or how they see themselves like accessing those resources or showing shame, letting people know that they're sick. So there is an issue, but there are also other elements to consider. We're talking about, for example, things related to gender, male versus female. Research has consistently shown that for some issues, linguistic related issues, there is a difference whether the language is spoken by men or women. I'm also thinking about age groups. For example, a comment I made about accessing information on the computer. Google is everywhere. Everybody normally has access to a computer. But if you're like my father, who is in his 80s, and I can pretty much say he's basically computer illiterate, I don't think he knows what button to press to turn the computer on. Having all that information, it's useless because he will never be able to access that. So yes, I would like to know what Gonzalo, Dr. Campos think about it. So I will say that yes, even if they are in the same country, cultural differences may have will have an impact on language itself, dialectal variation, how that language is used, but it's not the only issue. More sociolinguistic resources like gender, educational attainment, age group will also have an impact in dealing with the answer to that question.
I'm not sure.
Hey, Dr. Campos.
Yeah, so it's a very broad question, and I think it's also a very common one, whether language and culture are intertwined. And there's no clear answer, but generally speaking, people who speak the same language tend to have the same, similar culture, of course. There are many similarities. But just like Marisa was saying, it's not just the language, it's also the dialect, the social group, age. There's just too many factors involved in making sure that the message really gets across. And the more we know about it and the more we are aware about it, the better the message we can send. To give you just a silly example, if most of our recommendations, for example, included staying at home, that implies that you have a home. And there are a lot of people without a home. Many of the recommendations to say, wash your hands properly. That assumes you have access to clean water. And that's almost irrelevant of the language. But I think, and hopefully I think and so there's a lot more going on, right? But minimally, we should be able to have access to translation in different languages as quickly as possible. It shouldn't be especially, and this is what the crisis made us aware of. It has to be done quick. We can't, any week or month that we waste trying to think of or trying to find someone to translate information is a lot. And for that, we need to have the system in place. We can't improvise it. We shouldn't be looking for, is there anyone who speaks Spanish here? No, we should have that information right there, at least about who can do it.
And also, I would like to ask, the question is not as simple as, is there anybody who speaks Spanish? It's like, is there anybody who has the background and necessary knowledge about medical terms to translate and interpret that than Spanish? Because, for example, the thing I mentioned before, when I was teaching the Spanish for medical purposes, my students had to do interpretation. And when I was reading the text, they had to interpret. I didn't ever speak of Spanish, and I didn't even know what those medical terms were. I had no idea. So yeah, it's not only knowing Spanish, it's being knowledgeable of those particular terms, and yes, having immediate access to them. It's crucial, and people's lives depend on that.
Makes a lot of sense. I mean, we have the same trouble in English, right? Okay, let's go on. Maybe start with Dr. Campos this time. Another question here. It's from an alum, and so I always like to call out the alums. We have an alum who works with immigrants as a service coordinator. We have, of course, a strong culture of service at the University of Mary Washington, and so I loved reading this question. So hi, Cara, just saying hello. A large part of this alum's job is advocating for language access for clients. There are regulations that require providers to use interpretation, but it's not always enforced. So the question is, how can we advocate at a larger level for language access for all? So maybe Dr. Campos, you want to maybe start with some comments on that? How do we advocate?
I think it's a great question. I think there's a lot of places to advocate for it. And the first one is by law, by knowing about existing laws in Virginia, for example. There are laws that are there, that are being passed, that are being discussed. The more we know about that, well, that would be the first place. And then, of course, we can advocate for that in pretty much everything we do. But the advocacy starts pretty much with us valuing having a multilingual community. The United States is a multilingual community, and we should take advantage of that instead of seeing it as an impediment for growing as a society. But law is definitely the one place to do it, and that's how you can get. That's how you get a cascade effect into other areas. I don't know if Marisa, you would like to add something to that.
I 100% agree with what you said. Multilingualism is something that should be valued, and I would like to add that, especially here in the United States, how we are. The question was about advocating. I think we can also contribute to change that idea that just speaking one language is okay, is the right thing to do, because everybody else is learning English. Why should we learn another language? Or they're in the country, everybody else should learn English. So placing value on learning more than one normal language, and finding value on that in seen as something positive. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes I've got the impression that it was not a good thing to learn a second language. Think about, for example, again, not everyone, but with our language requirements, some students are like, oh, now I have to study another language. Well, it might be easier for some students, more complicated for others. But the thing is, you are learning something new that has a value, that is your gateway for learning culture, learning things that you don't know about, learning to appreciate multilingualism, multiculturalism. So I think changing that little chip that it's not really necessary to learn another language. Now we have Google Translate. Everybody else in the world is learning English. Will actually benefit us. And like Dr. Campos has said, it will create like that cascade effect that will eventually help us all.
I think we have a strange paradox in it's because English is the dominant language in the world. It's very hard for us, I include myself, as senior speakers, even if it's my second language, to see the need for any other language, because mostly everyone will have some knowledge of English. But that's not good. And if we look at other countries, especially wealthier countries, it is actually wealthier people who speak two or more languages. And the United States, the impression that I get is that it's not wealthier people, it's actually poorer people who speak two languages. And then if you put that together with the fact that most people on earth speak two languages or more, I think we have been misled we have this curse of using the most important language today. And it happens all the time. It's not just the United States. But we can definitely, to go back to the question, advocacy at the state level is definitely important.
Okay, I'm going to continue a little bit in this vein because we have a question here about dissemination of information. But in cases where maybe before COVID, the community centers were really important places to disseminate information, especially about public health. And then during the pandemic, these places were closed down. And so, what have we learned about maybe other ways to communicate this information to, multiple groups?
You mean like physical spaces, or just like communicating in general?
It could be physical spaces. I think that possibly this question was posed thinking about, you had mentioned the posters. Dr. Campos had talked about the virtual communication. So, what was happening? What were other ways that information was being communicated, and maybe how was that effective or not?
Well, do you want to talk about this first, or should I go first?
Okay.
So we were talking about that before. That is actually a very interesting question, because you're absolutely right, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, everything shut down. So except for the very, very basic services, there were no community centers, there were no schools open, and definitely having access to that information was challenging, to say the least. Obviously, access via computers, access via online websites has been crucial. I think there's been an effort to make all this information available, like even more available than before, and that has played a huge role. Okay, the issue, for example, I was trying to make, the point I was trying to make with my presentation is that as good as it is and as great of a service it has provided, for some communities, because of the features of those communities, the online access to information might not have been the best option. And true, if those community centers are closed, it's more difficult to find out. But maybe, I don't know, especially here in the United States, the very first thing that comes to mind is, how about newspapers, those free newspapers that people have access to, that's printed information that everybody in the community can have access to and read and find out. It doesn't necessarily imply like face-to-face close contact. Maybe this is a very a long shot, but I was thinking maybe transportation means like buses can have these billboards or board or information flyers saying, if you want to find out about COVID, these are like phone numbers or to access that information in different languages. So it's a matter, it all boils down to creativity. I'm pretty sure there are like more creative ways than others to try to disseminate that information, even with really restrictive circumstances, like the closing of those centers, the closings of schools. Obviously, you don't want to get to a hospital and find out what your resources are when you're like having problems beating them. But yes, like flyers, access, visibility for that information in places like hospitals, or the very few places that didn't close because of the COVID pandemic. I think that will make definitely a difference for any population that we're talking about. Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, the next question is one that I'm really happy to be able to ask, because I've been very intrigued by infographics and work with infographics in my visual rhetoric class and think about how they can be used for persuasive effect. I'd like to ask you both, if you wouldn't mind commenting on this, the way that the infographics have been utilized in distributing COVID information. Has it been effective, or has it hindered communication with international populations? And in particular, thinking about language barriers, is the use of an infographic something that can help overcome some of those barriers, or does it further complicate it?
I think it has been both. If the general impression that I have is that, I'm going to say just people have been great during COVID, in the sense of being able to, we didn't know what to do, right? But we adapted, and a lot of people who were in charge of disseminating health information quickly adapted in many cases to give more accurate information. And infographics definitely help, because they provide a lot more context, and it's easier to see. It's easier to give you an idea with graphics than with a lot of language. Just think about this: the recommendation for doing like the 6 feet separation that doesn't work in the metric system, for example. If you tell someone from a different country to keep 6 feet apart, they don't know what 6 feet are. And the same thing with the example that I gave before about the house. If you don't live in a house, and you don't have to be homeless not to be in a house, if you live in a different type of construction, seeing a picture of the place where you live actually is a lot more helpful than seeing a picture of a house in suburban America, for example. But that has to, but what we need for that is raise awareness of the kind of things that can change. But we also need a chain of people who are aware of that and who are willing to put in the work. And hopefully we have that system in place before we are hit by an international crisis. Does that answer your question, or is there something you would like to add to? I don't know, maybe Marisa would like to say something. I haven't
The only thing I would like to add is, yes, obviously visual information, those infographics has been a great resource, but I also think it's been an ongoing learning process, like Gonzalo mentioned. When you, probably for most of us here living in the United States, talking about feet when discussing distance sounds like so natural that we cannot think of anybody else not understanding that. I believe that I read in somewhere there was an issue with this thing, so they changed it to boxes. Like think about like how many boxes you can put. Like if you have like 8 boxes between people, that's the distance you need to keep, because people could understand boxes versus feet or centimeters and things like that. So it's been a learning process, learning trial and error, so to speak. So obviously those you talk about whether the infographics could make it better or hinder that multilingual communication. So it's been a little bit of both, but because we didn't know, now we have much more information. Probably producing infographics now, they are more accurate, and it's better to follow their directions or understanding what they mean than the very first ones that originally came out. Also, for example, with those infographics, I would like it also to relate it to the issue I discussed with translation and interpretation in a time of need where that information had to be available like right away. If they couldn't find anyone translating that information, probably they relied on Google Translate or any other translation application. So if that's the text that they included in the infographic, probably it confused people more than anything else. It's not an infographic, but I remember going to my OB-GYN one time, and they had a sign in Spanish. It took me a while to understand. It says that there was a no-show fee. Okay, the way I translated no show, it was like Broadway show. And I'm like, why are they talking about Broadway shows here? It's just like somebody needed to translate that. So they went to the dictionary and looked for the word show, and the very first one they found, that's what they put in that big signal. So imagine something like that happening, that lovely infographic that is trying to help people, and then they use something like that. Yeah, that's hindering communication. So hopefully now they notice that, and the final version of the infographic has the right word. Does helping us all.
Just to add,
no, Broadway.
Oh, Anna,
Sorry,
if you don't mind, I would like to share my screen because I found exactly what I was talking about. Let me just 1 second. So do you see the article? Okay, so these are 2 different signs that they made. They were made in Quechua and Spanish. And what they did that was pretty accurate was to think of exactly the house where they lived in. So this is where they live in that particular community, and there's another picture of the house. And the message is the same, but the picture, of course, really helps you understand exactly what they meant. That was my example.
I have a practical question. A student, or I assume a student, it might not have been a student, has asked a question about how do you become a language interpreter? And the student, or this person, made the point that American Sign Language has a very rigid and specific requirements, and wondered if that is also true for language interpretation.
That is an excellent question. And actually, I was discussing that with one of my students. I have an independent study and supervising an independent study this summer, and she's working on interpreting services in health related scenarios. And we were discussing actually the other day that, for example, if you want to be an interpreter for court, there is an exam that you need to take, and there are certain things in place to guarantee that the person who does interpreting in court has the vocabulary, has experience, has the knowledge to conduct that particular service. When we talk about medical interpretation, it's not something so strict. So it depends on different states, different counties, Okay, when we did research for that independent study, we found out that, for example, different areas of Virginia, depending on which hospital you're talking about, they will require an exam, others did not require an exam. And even those who required an exam, it was only language-based. There was no cultural component attached to it. So what we are actually discussing, and she's working on that for her paper, is there is not a unanimous set of rules established for becoming a hospital interpreter. It's basically you have to go there and try to ask somebody what the requirements for that particular county or that particular hospital are, and then move from there. There's nothing so well established like what they do for court.
I forgot if the question was about translation or interpretation, or was
interpretation.
Interpretation only? Okay. Because for translation, there are many universities offer master's degrees.
And certificates, yes.
Right. But master's degrees too. And of course, they become more specific. So it's that alumni wants to be an interpreter or a translator. It's just a matter of trying to find, the more they specialize, the more narrower the options. And just like Marisa said, there are, for legal interpretation, there are certain very strict requirements in place.
For court, yes.
All right. Well, thank you both very much. This was really a terrific conversation here on a very important topic that many of us are, I think, learned a lot this afternoon. So thank you both so much. Dr. Gonzalo Campos and Dr. Marisa Martinez Mira, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
And
thank you
all of you out there, please join us next week. We have two terrific presentations coming up. On Tuesday, we have Dr. Kristen Marsh. She's a professor of sociology, and she's actually the department chair for the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. A really interesting topic: how equal are women and men? U.S. working mothers' vulnerability in a pandemic. Something a lot of us know a lot about and can relate to. And then on Thursday, Dr. Jeffrey McClurkin, our chief of staff here at the University of Mary Washington, talking about the university after COVID. And he's not just talking about UMW, but he's talking about higher education in general and how we proceed after UMW. So it should be a couple of fascinating talks next week and some really good discussion. So please join us. Students, don't forget to log out of the webinar and join us in the discussion groups to continue the conversation with our discussion leaders. And thank you all for joining us. I'm Keith Mellinger for the College of Arts and Sciences. We'll see you all next week. Thank you.